Good morning. And welcome to the church today. I'm very happy to be your worship leader. I'm Paulette Lichtman-Panzer. I'm usually a worship associate helping out a little bit more in the background, but today I'm going to take you through what I think is going to be a wonderful service that focuses around the theme of good trouble. As we begin today, I invite you to silence your phone, close other windows on your computer, take a deep breath, and center yourself. We always open in welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoic tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We honor the ancestors of these tribes, always, not just on Sundays.
I'm Warren McLean. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm happy to be your worship associate today. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive community that seeks to create a more just and compassionate world. I hope you have a name tag or have your name on the Zoom name tag. If you need help with that, let us know and let us know in the chat. If you are new to Accotink and would like to talk to us more about this church, just about anyone here can help you with that, especially our worship leader, Paulette, or anybody with a cross name tag, myself. So just let us know. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for social hour after the service, either online or in person, and immediately after the service. So we're glad you came here. We're glad you decided to come to our church today.
In March of 2018, I demonstrated with my granddaughter and Stan in DC. My granddaughter lived in Lynchburg. She was 16 years old, and she had never gone to a large demonstration to support a cause that she was passionate about. We took her to the march to show our strong support for gun law changes after the February killing of 17 high school students and the wounding of 17 more students at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. We gathered, we marched, we heard the teenage student from the high school speak strong words to the politicians and to the people marching. Unfortunately, I knew better than our granddaughter that Americans have a slow and arduous battle before we can end the unrestricted and easy buying and selling of guns in this country, and the parallel difficulty in ending mass shootings and ending gun violence. But for our granddaughter and myself, and any of you experiencing frustration about laws and policies our legislators are unable or unwilling to even modify or change, we must not get lost in despair. We have to maintain hope, be optimistic, and like John Lewis, keep showing up, marching, and speaking.
Good morning. So today we are talking about making good trouble. I like that phrase. Many things that we can pursue in life are a lot of trouble, but rarely do we hear the words good and trouble combined. It is so nice to consider what good trouble looks like. John Lewis once said, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. John Lewis was an American civil rights leader and a congressman that worked hard to make good trouble. In the spirit of John Lewis, our Time for All Ages story is about a woman that became the youngest congresswoman in America, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Many of us know her as AOC. AOC reminds us that everyone, regardless of their age, race, creed, wealth, or zip code, is capable of being a voice for change. Phenomenal AOC, The Roots and Rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, written by Annika Aldemai Denise, illustrated by Loris Laura. On January 3rd, 2019, in a white suit, the color worn by suffragettes, gold hoops, a wink to her Bronx roots, and red lipstick, a nod to her Latini dad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became the youngest woman ever to serve in Congress. At 29, her startling rise shocked the establishment and shattered the status quo. How did one young Borussia smash expectations and become a phenomenal force in politics? It begins where it all began. In the boogie-down Bronx, home of hip-hop, El Condado de la Salsa, New York City's northern crown, in 1989, a baby girl named Alexandria was born in the working-class neighborhood of Parkchester to Sergio Ocasio and Blanca Cortez. Her parents called her Sandy. Then came Gabriel, Sandy's little brother. Life wasn't easy for Sergio and Blanca, raising their young family while making ends meet. But they knew the value of working in and for your community. Proud and resourceful, hardworking and hopeful, Familia always came first. When Sandy was 5, her dad decided to move the family to Yorktown Heights, a quieter suburb with better schools, where his children could thrive. This was the plan, this was the dream. The reality, not everything was sunny in suburbia. There was a divide. Sandy saw it and felt it. At school, her teachers sometimes discouraged her. They didn't believe a brown girl from the Bronx could be the top of the class in reading, math, and science. But Sandy proved them wrong again and again. Why did they underestimate her? The answer lay alongside the Bronx River Parkway, as pristine houses and picket fences gave way to bustling boulevards and brick buildings. Traveling between two worlds, Sandy witnessed the gaps between wage-working and wealthy neighborhoods. Yorktown wasn't better than Parkchester, but it had more resources. Inequity lit a spark of activism in Sandy that would later become a fire. Sandy's parents had scraped and saved to give her a shot, and she was not going to waste it. She enrolled in pre-med at Boston University and would later study abroad in Niger, caring for expectant mothers whose communities had been ravaged by famine. In Sandy's second year, she got a call no daughter wants to get. Poppy was sick. Things had taken a bad turn. Make me proud were the last words between Sandy and Sergio. The loss of her father and her experience studying abroad opened Sandy's eyes to the deep connections between birthplace and destiny. She switched her major to economics and international relations and graduated with honors. Top of her class, Sandy could have worked anywhere, but losing Sergio had left her mother and brother struggling. So she went back to New York, back to the Bronx, to help and to heal. She cleaned houses with Mommy, then took a job as a bartender and waitress. Working at Flats Fix was a master class in low-wage work, immigrant labor, and treatment of women in the workplace. As always, Sandy was an excellent student. She was also an activist. Canvassing for progressive candidates, she learned that change was made by those who organize, by feet pounding pavements and knuckles knocking on doors, by showing up and speaking up for her community. In 2016, when Sandy got the chance to go to Standing Rock Reservation to join more than 300 Native tribes protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline, she saw the power of young people coming together for climate justice and the protection of indigenous land. At that moment, Sandy knew she could be a voice for change too. But how? Brand new Congress. BNC needed a candidate to represent the Bronx and Queens. Sandy's brother, Gabriel, nominated his big sister to be on the ballot. BNC's mission: to make government work for all Americans from Parkchester to Standing Rock. When BNC called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, cum laude college graduate, bartender, organizer, activist, proud Puerto Rican daughter from the Bronx, said yes. But like the water protectors protesting the pipeline, winning would take a grassroots movement. To defeat her powerful opponent, Joseph Crawley, candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had to build a coalition of people, not politicians, of change makers, not corporate takers, of immigrants and dreamers striving for justice, equity, and dignity. So Alexandria got to work, door knocking by day, bartending at night. She'll never beat him, many thought. Young, smart, and savvy, she used the power of social media to get out her message. Every day gets harder for working families to get by, Alexandria said. The rent gets higher, health care covers less and less, and our income stays the same. We deserve a champion. It's time to fight for a New York that working families can afford. On June 26, 2018, when all the primary votes were counted, it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by a landslide. She clobbered Crowley, a 10th term incumbent, heir to the powerful political machine. We meet a machine with a movement, said Alexandria. That day, the phenom AUC was born. In Washington, D.C., where she would soon climb the steps of the Capitol building as the nation's youngest congresswoman, Alexandria recalled dipping her toes into the reflecting pool at the Washington Monument on a long-ago trip to the Capitol with her father. This is our government. It belongs to us, Sergio had told her. Her work had just begun, but one thing was certain. Sergio Ocasio was correct. The government of the United States belongs to all people, regardless of race, creed, wealth, or zip code. And Alexandria had made him proud. So I'd like to end with a quote from AOC. Justice is about making sure that being polite is not the same as being quiet. In fact, oftentimes the most righteous thing you can do is shake the table. That sounds like some good trouble right there to me. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Timothy Schwartz-Watchin. My pronouns are he and him, and I've been a member of this community since 2020, beginning of the pandemic. I was asked to give a personal story of my own about good trouble in my life, and it took a lot of figuring out what this was and what it meant to me, and I started with where I ended up, and I ended up here, and at this church and at this community, and I love that. And I'm trying to figure out what trouble I went through to get here. And it starts back when I was younger. I was born and raised a really devout Catholic in a very devout Catholic community. It was perfect. What could go wrong? I mean, it was easy. Life was easy. I was in the right religion. I was in the right community. It was a very devout community, the most devout diocese in the country. And I went to an amazing Catholic high school. And it was like, so what could go wrong? And I knew that my life was going to be great. I was going to go to heaven, and everything in my life was going to be awesome. I was perfect road for success. And the problem was I just started to realize that I had a wall around me that was built, and it took a long time for me to see it. And one of the first times I saw it was my brother-in-law. He married my sister. He came out as gay, and they ended up getting divorced, but he was still a very good, close friend of the family. And we were talking. This was back about the time of gay marriage discussion in the laws concerning it. And as a very devout Catholic, I said, I don't believe it is right. And he looked at me, and he said, how can you be so hateful? I'm not a hateful guy. I don't think I am. And I didn't think I was then, and I didn't cause trouble. I was very easygoing. In fact, I almost always find the benefit of the doubt in someone's argument. And I'm willing to pay attention to what they're saying, because I'm usually like, I'm probably wrong in some ways. But I held my foundation of my faith, and it stuck with me. It was like, what is it about me that was being hateful? How could he say that about me? And it was really hard. And so the thing was that the school was great because I learned some really great foundations for myself of my faith, and some of those key things that I learned that I definitely took with me and integrated into myself is that God is truth, God is love, and these are things I hold dear to myself. And these were also used as a way to define what sins are and what not to do. And the problem was that story with my brother-in-law still hurt, and I didn't know what to do with it. A few years go by. I go to community college. I get out of community college. I work for a few years. I go to the military. I get out of the military. I use my GI Bill, go to college again. So I'm in college now with a bunch of classmates who are about 10 years younger than me. And one of my classmates there, go figure, she went to the same high school I did. I was like, this is awesome. It's like, wow, why aren't you going to Catholic campus ministry with me? He's like, I'd rather not. Turns out she was gay or lesbian, as she put it. So she's part of the LGBT community, and she identified that way. But the way I communicated with her, she was smart and she was on point. And this went against everything I knew of for how I was raised. Like, people in that category, they're different. They don't think right. They're wrong. And it struck me as like, what am I not getting? What am I missing? And it took me to realize that something was wrong in how I saw the world. And speaking with her, and I started to realize I had a view wrong. God is love. If they have love in their life, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? I can't look at their sin. I had to see this. So I had to start looking at myself and realize, what was it about me and my life in the world I lived in that I was seeing wrong? And I started to see the walls that were put up, that I was raised in. And it took me meeting her, meeting my wife, acknowledging the world I lived in was not perfect, that the church I was part of was not perfect, that they were not communicating what they needed to me. And it made me realize I had a responsibility to myself to stand up and actually realize I needed to take a step for my family, for myself, in my community, and I had a responsibility for it. I couldn't just sit there and accept the life I was given on a silver platter and say, life is perfect, I don't need to do anything. Everything's great. And so that's where I came from. And that's where I am now is I needed to see a way to see the world in honesty, in truth, and to find love, to find God in everybody around me. And because it's not just in the Catholic Church. It's not just in the holy people, because holiness exists in all of us. And it took me a lifetime to come to the conclusion that I have the ability to see it. So, thank you.
When this topic was first introduced, I talked with Rev Love about it last year, and the topic was called Roiling the Waters for Good Trouble. And so that was the direction I'm taking with my talk. So some of you who have been around for more than a few years know that I was very involved with trying to get better care for nursing home residents. I was and am very grateful for the support our grassroots organization received from AUUC. As with many advocates, my activism started for a personal reason. In the late 1990s, my mother required nursing home care. I was the proverbial babe in the woods. I had no idea what nursing homes were like. Her experience gave me many reasons to roil the waters. Prior to her first admittance to a nursing home, my mother was walking without assistance and was continent. However, she walked so slowly that she was confined to a wheelchair. Eventually, she could no longer walk at all. When she needed to use the bathroom, call bells went unanswered. She became incontinent. Bed sores on her feet and buttocks were common. One day I found her shaking uncontrollably and incoherent. She had pneumonia, but no one had noticed. She was often awakened at 3 or 4 a.m. for her shower. Her personal items were stolen, including a small doll that she treasured. On her first day at yet the third facility, she was left alone to eat her dinner. She was found on the floor, having choked on a pear. She survived, but her brain was irreparably damaged. Sadly, stories like her were legion. It was at this facility that we formed our advocacy group. What we came to realize that the most caring certified nursing assistant was given a job that could not be done. Who among us could get 15 or more debilitated people up and ready for breakfast at the inflexible 8 a.m. time? Although we had many grievances, our main objective was to get minimum staffing ratios mandated. We spread the word about our cause, and soon caregivers from other nursing homes joined us. We invited politicians to our monthly meetings. We opened a chapter in Roanoke. We got hundreds of people to sign petitions and went to Richmond to plead our case. At one session, after relating the mistreatment my mother was receiving, I told them who my mother really was: a professional writer, painter, piano player, organist, knitter, crocheter. Now, if you will bear with me, I would like to read the last part of this plea that I made to the legislators. I would not take issue with you if you called it a threat. This is what I said to them. Now that you know who my mother really is, don't you think she deserves a better end to her life? We tend to see people as they are today, but each person has a story to tell. Lives of intelligence, talent, creativity, and yes, grief and sorrow too. But I think the most sorrowful part is ending our quality lives with no quality in our lives. You have the power to change this situation by mandating appropriate staff levels. If you choose to do nothing, remember that someday you may find yourself, like my mother, sitting strapped into an immovable wheelchair, sitting in your own waste, sitting, waiting for hours to be fed, sitting and waiting and waiting and waiting, hoping for death. I'd like to tell you that that made an impact. It did not. The next day after my testimony, I went to visit her. I found her lying naked on top of her blanket in a manner too horrifying to recount here. This occurred in the same month that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid rated this nursing home as having 0 deficiencies. It was difficult for advocates to stay the course. People who, like myself, had jobs and other family to care for became stressed out caring for their loved ones and so worn down that once their loved one died, they moved on. After 11 years of due diligence, with only one major success to show for it, I too gave up. But others, including Delegate Vivian Watts, who had worked with us tenaciously, stayed the course. Fast forward to 2022. Thanks to Watts and others, a minimum staffing bill is on the docket. Hopefully, it will become a law either this year or next. It would be very presumptuous of me to suggest that this is occurring because of my advocacy, but Rev Lev suggested that perhaps I had helped by planting a seed. If that be true, it would give me great pleasure to know that I planted a seed that roiled the waters. Thank you.
Mine is a father-daughter story. In August 1963, the air was abuzz with talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington. I had just turned 17. I held my first paying job at Mr. Donuts, which was at the intersection of Route 50, 236, and 29 to 11. The plan for the March on Washington was for folks to converge at that intersection and walk, over the next couple of days, walk Route 50 into the city, stopping along the way for sit-ins at eating establishments on that route into the city. The manager of Mr. Donuts held a meeting of his employees and stated that we would not be serving any, and he used a word we no longer tolerate, marchers who might stop at our donut coffee shop. I was shocked. My family had only a couple of months earlier actually moved to Virginia from New England. This was new territory for me, with parents who always spoke very respectfully of all people and who might even have been called progressive, even though we didn't use that term in those days. I marched my incensed 17-year-old self home, reported what the manager had ordered, and declared that I would serve whomever came into that shop during my shift. And if I got fired, well, so be it. My dad very quietly and very firmly said, "No, you will do as you're told. You are an employee, and as such will follow your boss's instructions. You need this job." I could hardly believe my ears. My hero father, who in my estimation stood head and shoulders over everybody else, that day fell off his knight's horse into the realm of being, disappointingly, merely human, the product of his own Depression-era childhood. I wish that I could report that I bucked my dad's interference in my early outrage in the face of injustice, but I was young, and my obedient self all tangled up with what it meant to be a girl in my family and in the world at large. My parents had always assumed a college education for my brothers. For me, not so much. When time came, my mom and dad were surprised, but not particularly opposed, as long as I agreed to attend an all-girls Catholic college. So, in 1964, off I went to St. Mary of the Woods in Terre Haute, Indiana, which, by the way, shared a border wall with the Indiana State Penitentiary. Mass on Sundays was mandatory. The gate to the outside world firmly shut tight at 6 p.m. every night. Tucked away at St. Mary's, I was mostly isolated from the civil rights activities over the next 4 years. It was at St. Mary of the Woods, however, that I began to pay attention to the details of gender injustice, beginning with the way my church viewed women and their role in the world. Surrounded by fellow female students reading Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, I honed my ability to challenge the status quo. I returned home a full-fledged feminist. My father was horrified to learn that he had sent a daughter to college who just might now go burn her bra in some harebrained women's liberation event. Again, my dad and I completely at odds with one another. The worst, however, was yet to come. My father was a proud American, a veteran of World War II, who had little tolerance for the emerging movement in protest of the Vietnam War. I know it grieved him when I joined what he called the riffraff, marching the streets of Washington, D.C. I believe it was in pain rather than anger that he adopted the mantra, "Love it or leave it." It was very common at that time. By then I was newly married. My husband and I sold what little we owned, packed up 2 suitcases apiece, and we left. We lived on the other side of the world for 5 years. Time calmed the passions and smoothed out the rough edges that chafed the relationship between me and my family. The thing is, even in the most volatile of times, my dad never cut me off. He never made his love for me dependent on my falling in line with his worldview. He held tightly to his own notions of what should be. And in doing that, he presented a bulwark against which I could push in my own personal quest to build a new way. I challenged, examined, researched, developed reasoned arguments for the many debates we would have over many years. I can't say that I actually won any of those debates, but as he grew older, my dad was more inclined to hand me a small concession that was for me an amazing piece of treasure. He would peer over his glasses and say, "Suzanne, you make a good point. I'll have to think about it." And to my mind, it doesn't get better than this.
Like Tim, as I pondered the phrase good trouble, I realized I'm really not a troublemaking person. Sure, I've marched for causes, first in Chicago as a member of the Chicago Teachers Union on the picket line, striking for smaller classroom size. I think I had maybe 47 in my classroom at that time, and of course better wages. And then a few times we marched in supporting causes important to me, freedom of choice, gun law changes. But, you know, there are only a few John Lewises that come along. I, too, was raised Catholic. I would put him up there with any of the saints that I'm familiar with. But my story of good trouble is not dramatic or all that unusual. But a few of you out there, especially those from out of town, might relate to it very well. In early 1973, I joined the South Bend, Indiana Unitarian Church. I became a member of the church mainly to be connected to a group of people where my 2 small children would sometimes interact with males who could be role models for what a reliable and trustworthy man could be. I also hoped that I would make friends who generally shared my view of the world. I was close to finalizing a divorce and definitely was not looking for a boyfriend or a spouse. I have always been able to get a good job, and I knew that I could support my family without the help of their father. But in the summer of 1974, I met Stan. After about a year and a half of serious dating, Stan and I decided to take a chance. We would move to Ann Arbor, Michigan, so he could pursue a different degree, this one in health physics, and his son and my 2 kids could begin the adventure of splitting expenses and living together. In my case, I was able to get a fascinating and somewhat groundbreaking job at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. I loved that job. It was right on campus. Some of my colleagues became good friends, and the professors at the Institute were challenging to work with. My boss was easygoing. He let me set up and run my office. I was the very first person at the Survey Research Center to develop methodology for conducting survey research via the telephone rather than in person. This was 1975, and no one was running long-established national health, satisfaction, or labor surveys via the telephone. I hired a staff of 30 or so interviewers. Each of my employees was either currently attending the university or had graduated with bachelor's or master's degrees and wanted to stay in Ann Arbor so badly that they were willing to work for me. Our kids were happy, I was happy, and Stan got his degree. Now comes the trouble. Stan got his dream job in Washington, D.C. at EPA. Although Stan proposed marriage over and over again, I was not willing to tread that path to the altar ever again. When he accepted the job offer at EPA, I knew I could easily stay in Ann Arbor with my 2 kids and my fantastic job, while Stan and his son went to the DC area by themselves. To make a long story shorter, Stan convinced me to just come to DC for a fun weekend and a bit of potential house hunting while he interviewed at EPA to work out the final details of his job. Well, in DC, I didn't like what I saw. We couldn't find a place that would be suitable for our family. The traffic was awful. The cost of living was sky high. And I didn't have a job waiting for me there. Staying in Ann Arbor seemed to be the very best solution for me and my kids. But while I was walking around the DC Mall on my own, I serendipitously walked by the Hirshhorn Art Museum. From behind the fence that surrounded the museum near their outdoor sculpture garden, up popped the head of a bronze Henry Moore statue. Now, if you love modern sculpture, you can't help notice the rounded bronze shapes of his work. So I just had to walk into the garden, and there I saw the Burghers of Calais by Auguste Rodin, Skyhooks by Alexander Calder, and of course the Henry Moore piece, right out there in the open, for free. Well, I wasn't going to get that kind of art in Ann Arbor, and Stan and I and the kids were very content with one another. So I very reluctantly decided to make the move to this area. But then trouble reared its ugly head. It was hard to get to the museums from our home. The museums were free, but parking was not. And our neighbors were not friendly like I was used to in every other city I had ever lived in. As examples, birthday invitations for our kids would be sent, and some people would not RSVP, but then they would send their kids to the party. I expected to have 5 children. Now I had 7 kids. I had no party gifts planned for the extras. Another issue. My friends at the job I got lived in Annapolis or Howard County or Calvert County, Maryland, and they were not eager to spend time driving all the way to Fairfax to become part of our close social network. Theater was so expensive, we couldn't afford to take the kids, as I had always done in the past. I could go on, but you get the idea. What to do? Go back to Ann Arbor with my kids? But something great happened just at the time I was trying to figure things out. We found out that a new Unitarian church was forming in Burke. There we met great folks who shared our liberal viewpoints and actually lived in our general neighborhood. Acquaintances became long-time friends. Reality tells us that there will be some challenges and circumstances that come along in our lives that we will never be able to change or understand. But in this case, I understood the problem, and we were able to come up with a very satisfying solution. I would never consider leaving this area now. I go into DC quite often. I love its art, theater, music, and history, and I know where the cheap parking lots are located. And by the way, I finally did marry Stan. In 1978, in our home, with our 3 kids as participants, moving here was definitely good trouble for me. Thank you.
My next good trouble is going to be a ramp up to here. So I was actually going to sign, hello, my name is Allison, in ASL, but I can't do that holding something. So Nancy initially emailed me about this week's theme of good trouble. And she was like, automatically, I thought of you. She's like, do you want to tell a story? And I was like, yeah, duh. And then I was like, crap, which one? I have been extremely lucky and blessed in my life to have people that have supported me, loved me, and always encouraged me to use my voice as an advocate. And so that started very early for me. I think the one that I landed on, though, was the first time that I really understood good trouble. Where, in John Lewis's words, get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and help redeem the soul of America. Obviously, I have visible disabilities, but there are so many with invisible disabilities. Those folks who are so often overlooked, who are turned away, or who are mocked for things that folks without disabilities or folks who have never met these people are dealing with. In my case, the first time I ran into it, not the first time I ran into it, but the first time I was able to do something about it. I was 22 years old. I had just graduated undergraduate. To kind of age myself here, I was making $12.50 an hour with a bachelor's degree in Jacksonville, Florida, and I was working as a geriatric case manager. I have skill with languages. I was fluent in ASL at that time, American Sign Language, fluent in French, and I eventually learned Russian because half my caseload was Russian. And I learned some German, but it was so terrible that my German client asked me to please stop. So, but when it came to my first client who was born deaf, she was born deaf and had 5 daughters who were also born deaf. And she taught for 35 years at the School for Deaf Children in St. Augustine, Florida. She worked her butt off. She had a pension, she had savings, she had everything. And then at 85, she was given a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And it progressed pretty quickly. I met her at age 92. And I met her eldest daughter, who was her caregiver, who had been so frustrated because she was also working full-time at the School for the Deaf. And she moved her mother into a house directly next to hers. But the home was not livable at the time she bought it. And so much of the money that her mother had saved went into making that home safe so her mother could age in place. Because of stories like we heard earlier of how hard and scary nursing homes can be, aging in place was incredibly important to this family. So was communication. And they played a joke on me. I showed up, this was in the winter, I came to meet them for the first time. It was about 4:30, 5 o'clock, so it was starting to get dark. I come in and the daughter is there, the mother is there, the mother is my client, and then the client's nursing aide, who was fluent in sign, was there. I immediately introduced myself to the daughter introduced herself to me, and then I turned to the mother, or to my client, introduced myself, explained why I'm here. She starts signing, and I am lost. I am so confused. And I look over, and her daughter is silently laughing, and then she signs sundown. Sundowners is something that many people with Alzheimer's experience. They have increased confusion, sometimes agitation, and a lot of times they lose all lucidity. If you've ever experienced that, try experiencing it while watching hands and the signs that do not make sense together. So this was my experience. She was laughing, she explained it. What had happened was the daughter had gone to Department of Social Services in Florida several times. And this daughter was the most organized human I have ever met in my life. She had receipts for everything because her mother no longer had money. The pension was going to paying 40 hours a week for an aide who could sign. You would think that the Americans with Disabilities Act would cover this, would help with this. The ADA was signed into law in 1990. I didn't realize how recent it was. But it wasn't until I started making some good trouble that we started to bolster the ADA law when it came to deaf and hard of hearing folks. I was a case manager, which meant I was the middleman. So when I walked in with the daughter to Department of Social Services, and the daughter first stepped up and wrote down, I'm deaf, I need help filling this form out and getting this done, and watched her be turned away, watched her be pushed aside and said, we don't have an interpreter, you'll have to find one of your own. My husband has a new term for me, it's called flamethrower alley. That came out. So I walked up and I said, I'm sorry, did you just deny this young woman her right to be able to advocate for her mother? Because at that time, there were resources. They weren't the best, but there were resources for folks who were deaf or hard of hearing. And this woman was telling my client's daughter that it wasn't going to happen. And it took me, at the time, an able-bodied young person, yelling and signing at the same time, which was actually really kind of funny because my sign really was accentuated. What ended up happening was they suggested she go to an adult daycare. And I was like, yeah, who's gonna talk to her? Show me an adult daycare in a range that is reasonable where she can communicate. And they couldn't give me an answer. They said, well, that's just how it's gonna be. Nope. So I went to battle with Florida, the state of Florida. I created a care plan that included care from somebody who could communicate. The Department of Justice, I have the quote written down so I didn't get it wrong, says effective communication is particularly critical in healthcare settings where miscommunication may lead to misdiagnosis, improper, or delayed medical treatment. And this was the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division's ADA business brief. And so I used that as my foundation. I fought my county, then I fought the state, and I won. I still wasn't done though. I won for one person. What happens when I moved? I had already met my husband who was in the Army and I knew I was leaving. What happened next? I met with other like-minded people, and together we spearheaded a bill, and we worked on it to amend the ADA to make sure that it was bolstered. I helped on that project in 2008 and 2009 before I moved to Louisiana. We won't talk about that time in our life. That's a dark period. But that bill that I helped write, that I helped champion, that I helped on, and that client's story, because the daughter was a huge part of it, and she was fantastic, and I still talk to her today. On September 25th, 2010, the Department of Justice published revised regulations to ensure that communication with these disabilities, those for deaf and hard of hearing, are equally as effective as communicated with people without disabilities. That was amended into the ADA. So now, you don't have to fight if you're deaf or hard of hearing for a higher care plan and getting care you deserve with communication that you can understand and you can have your dignity as you age in place. That was my fight.